7 German fighters appear above him in the tight formation. His fuel gauge reads critical. His radio is dead. He does not turn. He does not dive. He holds altitude and waits. The lead messes rolls into attack position. Still, he waits. What the enemy pilots cannot see is that this American has been counting seconds since they first appeared, and in his mind, the trap has already closed. Spring 1944. The air war over Western Europe has entered a brutal mathematics. American bomber streams carve contrails across occupied France and Belgium every morning. Beneath them, the wreckage of previous missions litters farmland and forest. The 8th Air Force is bleeding crews faster than training commands can replace them. For every factory hit, another 36 men vanish into fire or captivity. Fighter escorts stretch their range daily. The P-51 Mustang has given American pilots the legs to reach deeper into the Reich, but distance brings new problems. Fuel management becomes life and death. Navigation errors become fatal, and German fighter tactics evolve with every sortie. The Luftwaffe has learned to watch and wait. They let the bombers pass. They study the escort patterns. Then they strike at the stragglers, the damaged, the ones who wander from formation discipline. It is efficient, it is ruthless, and it works. At RAF Debain in Essex, the 4th Fighter Group operates from a former Royal Air Force station that still smells of damp concrete and aviation petrol. Ground crews work through the night, patching bullet holes and replacing glycol lines. Intelligence officers track loss rates that climb week after week. Pilots write letters they hope will never be mailed. The sound of Merlin engines fills the morning air as another mission spools up. Pre-flight checks, oxygen tests, gun harmonization verified. Each pilot carries the weight of what the statistics already say. 1 in 4 will not finish their tour. 1 in 10 will not return from today. Among them is a man the squadron has learned not to underestimate, though his manner suggests nothing remarkable. He speaks little at briefings. He does not boast in the officers' mess. He listens, he calculates. And when he flies, something in his timing separates him from even the finest pilots around him. His name is Captain Robert Johnson, and by the spring of 1944, he has survived what most could not. The ground crews know him as the pilot who returned with his fighters so damaged that engineers used the wreckage for training films. The armorers know him as the man who counts his ammunition before and after every engagement, tracking expenditure like a bookkeeper. The intelligence officers know him as the pilot whose combat reports read like technical documents, sparse and exact. He does not fit the archetype. He does not chase glory. He does not narrate his victories with swagger or color. When other pilots gather to relive the day's dogfights, Johnson reviews his gun camera footage in silence, frame by frame, deflection angle, closure rate, ammunition expenditure. What others call instinct, he calls math. What others call luck, he calls preparation. If this kind of story matters to you, like and subscribe so more of these quiet acts of brilliance are never forgotten. Robert Samuel Johnson was born in Lilton, Oklahoma in 1920. Dust and open sky, a town where mechanics were more common than lawyers, and common sense mattered more than pedigree. His father ran a small garage. Johnson grew up with grease under his nails and the logic of machines in his bones. Engines made sense. Carburetors, timing chains, valve clearances, all of it followed rules. If something broke, you found the cause. If something failed, you learned why. He was not a natural athlete. He was not particularly social. He read technical manuals for recreation. He understood systems, and when he looked at an airplane, he did not see romance. He saw an assembly of components that either worked in harmony or killed you. In 1941, he enlisted in the Army Air Corps, not out of rage or patriotism, though he felt both. He joined because flying interested him the way engines did. It was a puzzle of physics, fuel, and geometry, and he wanted to solve it. Flight training revealed something instructors had rarely seen. Johnson was not the smoothest pilot. He was not the fastest learner, but his precision was unsettling. He flew by numbers. He calculated fuel burns in his head. He could estimate altitude loss in a turn within 50 ft. Where other cadets relied on feel, Johnson relied on measurement. One instructor noted in his file that Johnson flew like an engineer pretending to be a pilot. It was not a compliment, but it was accurate. By the time he reached combat status and shipped to England in early 1943, Johnson had accumulated hours in the cockpit and a reputation for being unnervingly methodical. He did not drink heavily. He did not chase women in London on leave. He studied after action reports. He interviewed returning pilots about German tactics. He sketched engagement geometries in a notebook he carried everywhere. Other pilots thought him odd. Some thought him cold. None thought him a fool. His first kills came in the summer of 1943. Clean, efficient, no wasted ammunition. He maneuvered into position, fired short bursts, and confirmed the result. Then he disengaged and returned to escort duty. No victory rolls, no radio chatter, just the mission. By the end of that year, his tally had grown. So had his understanding of the enemy. He learned to recognize Luftwaffe unit markings from silhouette alone. He memorized the performance envelopes of the Focke-Wulf 190 and Mayseed 109. He calculated their turning radii, their climb rates, their fuel limitations. He studied them the way a chess player studies openings, not to admire, to defeat. But there was something else Johnson had learned that most pilots never would. He had learned the value of appearing vulnerable, of looking weak when you were not, of letting the enemy believe they held the advantage until the moment you proved otherwise. It was a kind of patience that required absolute confidence in your calculations. And, on a mission in April 1944, that patience would be tested beyond anything he had yet faced. The mission brief was routine: escort heavy bombers to a synthetic oil plant outside Leipzig, provide top cover through the initial penetration, defend against interceptors during the bomb run, shepherd the wounded back toward the channel. Johnson's flight launched at dawn. 4 Mustangs, each carrying full internal fuel and underwing drop tanks. The weather was broken cloud with visibility good enough for trouble. They climbed through cumulus and formed up over the English coast. Below, the gray water of the North Sea spread like hammered tin. Ahead, the continent waited. Somewhere over there, German radar operators were already tracking the incoming stream, the bomber. Formation droned eastward at 22,000 FT. Johnson's flight held station 3,000 FT above. The sky was bright and cold. Contrails stretched behind them like chalk lines. An hour into enemy airspace, the first attacks came. Vaca wolves diving from high sun. Johnson's element broke to engage. Gunfire stitched the sky. One German fighter spun away, trailing smoke. Another broke off and dove for the deck. Johnson did not follow. His job was the bombers. He reset his position and scanned the horizon. Then his number 3 called out a second wave, Messids climbing from below, angling for a rear quarter attack on the bomber stream. Johnson rolled his flight into a slashing dive. The Germans saw them coming and scattered. No kills, no losses. The bombers continued unharmed, but now Johnson's fuel situation had changed. The combat maneuvering had burned reserves faster than planned. He checked his gauge, enough to make it home. Barely. The bomber stream turned westward after the drop. Flak had claimed 2 fortresses. Another was losing altitude with 1 engine feathered. Johnson's flight moved to cover That was when his wingman's radio died, then his own. A malfunction or combat damage to the relay aircraft. Either way, he was now flying isolated, hand signals only, and fuel still dripping away with every minute. The crippled bomber fell behind. Johnson stayed with it, weaving above, scanning constantly. His fuel gauge now read below minimum for a safe return. He would have to make a decision soon. Abort and head for the coast, or stay until relief arrived. He stayed. 30 mies from the French border. The Germans found them. They came from the north. 7 Mises 109s and a loose gaggle flying at the same altitude, not diving, not climbing, just pacing them. Johnson saw them immediately. His heart rate did not increase. His hands did not tighten on the stick. He simply noted their position and began calculating. 7 hostiles, 1 damaged bomber with no defensive formation to fall back on. Johnson's flight was down to 3 effective fighters. Fuel was critical, radio was dead, and the enemy had not yet committed. That last detail told him everything. The Germans were not rookies. They were watching, waiting for the Americans to panic, waiting for someone to break formation and give them an isolated target. Johnson rocked his wings to get his wingman's attention. He pointed at the enemy formation, then tapped his head. Hold discipline. Wait. The seconds stretched. The bombers lumbered onward. The messes paced them like wolves alongside a wounded elk. One of Johnson's element began to drift forward, instinct pulling him toward the threat. Johnson chopped his hand sharply. Stay! The German formation shifted slightly. Still no attack. They were reading the Americans now, judging fuel states, watching for weakness. And then Johnson saw it. The lead mesa edged forward just slightly, testing. Johnson did nothing. Another few seconds. The German edged forward, again. Now 2 of the enemy fighters angled outward, preparing to bracket the escort. Still, Johnson held. His wingman glanced over, confusion visible, even through the oxygen mask. Why weren't they engaging? Because Johnson was counting. He was measuring closure rates and fuel states and angles of attack. He was watching how the Germans moved, and he was waiting for the one moment when their confidence would become assumption. The lead messes nosed down. Just fust the start of an attack run. Now the others began to commit. 2 broke right, 2 broke left. The gaggle spread into attack geometry. And that was when Johnson moved. He rolled, inverted, and pulled. Not toward the closest enemy, toward the leader, the one who had committed first and deepest. The Mustang dropped like a falcon. Airspeed climbed 400 knots, 420. The Germans saw him coming and broke hard left. Too late. Johnson had not been reacting. He had been anticipating. He fired a 2-con burst. 50 caliber rounds walked. Across the mess's fuselage. Pieces flew. The canopy shattered. The fighter snapped into a spin and fell away. Johnson did not watch it go. He was already reversing. The 2 Germans who had broken right were now climbing back, trying to re-engage. But Johnson had calculated their fuel state too. They had flown out to intercept. They had maneuvered. They were not going to chase a diving target all the way to the deck. He proved it by diving another 1,000 FT. The 2 messes hesitated, then leveled off. They had chosen survival over revenge. Above him, his wingman and element had engaged the remaining 4. Gunfire flickered. 1 German broke away smoking. Another tried to loop onto an American's tail and found Johnson climbing back into the fight from below. Johnson did not have the angle for a shot, but he did not need one. The Messerschmitt pilot saw him coming and abandoned the attack. The German rolled away and dove for separation. Now the math had shifted. 7 had become 4. 4 had become 3, and the 3 that remained were no longer hunting. They were calculating their own odds. Johnson climbed back to escort altitude. His fuel gauge showed red. Minutes left, maybe 10, maybe less. One of the remaining Germans made a half-hearted pass at the bomber. Johnson turned into him. The German did not press. He pulled up and away. The other 2 had already gone. Johnson reformed his flight. The crippled bomber droned westward, trailing smoke, but still flying. His wingman pulled alongside and gave a thumbs up. The radio was still dead, but the message was clear. They had survived. Johnson checked his fuel one last time. Not enough to reach England. He would have to put down an emergency strip on the coast. His element lead signaled the same problem. They crossed into friendly airspace 10 minutes later. Johnson spotted the emergency field and entered the pattern. Gear down, flaps down. The Mustang settled onto the pierced steel planking with barely enough. Fuel to taxi clear. When he shut down the engine, his hands were steady. His breathing was normal. He climbed out and walked to the operations tent to file his report. The duty officer asked how many he had claimed. Johnson said, 1 confirmed, maybe 2. The gun camera footage would decide. The officer asked how he had handled 7 hostiles with a fuel emergency and no radio. Johnson said he waited until they made a mistake. The officer pressed. What mistake? Johnson looked at him. They assumed patience was weakness. They assumed silence was fear. They were wrong. The gun camera footage confirmed 2 kills. Intelligence officers studied the engagement for hours. The geometry was unusual. Johnson had not followed standard doctrine. He had not turned into the first threat. He had not engaged the nearest target. Instead, he had waited. And when he moved with such precise timing that the enemy formation collapsed from the inside. One analyst noted that Johnson appeared to have deliberately held fire until the German leader was fully committed to his attack run. Another pointed out that Johnson's dive had not been evasive. It had been predatory, a calculated intercept based on predictive geometry. They asked him to explain his thinking. Johnson said he had watched how the Germans maneuvered during earlier missions. They followed patterns. They committed as a group once the leader committed. If you killed the leader at the moment of commitment, the formation lost cohesion. It was not luck. It was observation, pattern recognition, and the discipline to wait for the right moment, even when instinct screamed to act. Within weeks, his method was being taught in briefings. Do not react. Observe. Let the enemy commit, then strike at the decision maker. Johnson's kill tally climbed. By the end of his tour, he was credited with 27 confirmed aerial victories, making him one of the top American aces of the European theater. But the numbers never mattered to him, the way they mattered to others. What mattered was that fewer bombers were lost, that fewer crews died because someone had learned to think instead of react. His squadron mates began to understand what the quiet pilot had known all along. Aggression without timing was just noise. Courage without calculation was just death. And in the air war over Europe, where seconds decided survival, the ability to wait was the rarest skill of all. After the war, analysts studied Johnson's combat reports. They found that his average ammunition expenditure per kill was half that of other aces. His fuel management was textbook. His loss rate among pilots flying in his formations was measurably lower than average. He had not flown harder, he had flown smarter. And in doing so, he had proven that war was not just about bravery. It was about thinking clearly when everything around you demanded panic. Robert Johnson returned home in 1944. He did not write a memoir. He did not tour the country giving speeches. He went back to Oklahoma and lived quietly. He worked as a flight instructor for a time, then moved into aviation management. He rarely spoke about the war unless asked directly, and when he did, his answers were short, factual, unsentimental. But those who flew with him never forgot what he had taught them, that the best weapon in a dogfight was not the gun. It was the brain behind it. In the decades after the war, air combat evolved. Jets replaced propellers, missiles replaced bullets, radar replaced eyesight. But the principle Johnson had mastered remained. Patience was still a weapon, timing was still everything, and the ability to let your enemy believe they had the advantage until the moment you proved otherwise was still the mark of a master. Johnson lived into his 80s. He attended reunions and spoke occasionally to historians. He remained precise, methodical, unchanged by the fame he never sought. When he died in 1998, his obituaries noted his kills, his medals, his rank, but they missed the deeper truth. Robert Johnson had not just been an ace. He had been a thinker in a profession that rewarded action, a mathematician in a sky full of chaos. And his legacy was not the enemies he shot down. It was the men he brought home. Because in the end, the best pilots were not the ones who flew the fastest or fired the most. They were the ones who understood that survival was a calculation and every second of patience was a second someone else got to live. Johnson knew that, and he proved it 7 times over in a single fight that should have killed him. The quiet pilot who waited, who calculated, who turned silence into a trap, and when the enemy finally struck, found that the trap had been theirs all along.